Hello students, welcome to the EPG Pathshala. I'm Aparna Malviya from IIT Bombay and today I'm going to talk about module on small town culture in India. From paper Sociology of Urban Transformation, the objective of this module is to recognize tremendous diversity while also appreciating the more general forces that give shape to life in small towns. Currently, these towns are in the midst of rapid change through their connections to the wider world. Therefore, we will be discussing what are the social dynamics of transformation in small towns in India. Let us begin with a simple thought experiment. What images come to mind when we encounter the phrase life in a small town? Take a moment to reflect, and no doubt a few of you would have conjured images of slow-paced idyllic life, the kind of situations so beautifully described by R.K. Narayanan in his collection of short stories about the fictional town of Malgudi. And you may have recollected these three-line streets, the railway stations, whose tranquility is only sporadically punctuated by the din of arriving trains or the regional volleyball tournaments that town folk gather in mass to enjoy, given few other available sources of recreation. And others may have thought of images that are highly contrasting. To you, Pankaj Mishra's following words about a North Indian small town would have resonated strongly. Hogepoji, collection of buildings, wild grass and weeds unchecked everywhere. At the back of every house, gigantic mounds of garbage, quote unquote. To this description may be added to the supposed parochialism of small town folk and their subversion of civic procedures in favor of what Mishra, drawing on Thorstein Veblen, calls predatory prowess, or capacity to corner public resource through extra-legal means. So how do we reconcile these two starkly different words? One way forward is to consider small towns as a highly differentiated category, accounting for a variety of experiences. Indeed, it would be hard to paint towns with diverse histories with the same brush. In what follows, we shall therefore understand the small town as a heterogeneous concept at the level of form, institutions, and agents. But at the level of underlying urban processes, we will identify and discuss certain cross-cutting dynamics. And before we move to these, however, it is important to develop the analytical framework through which we argue contemporary urban processes and, in particular, small towns should be viewed. Come as a surprise to casual observers that only 14% of India's urban population lives in three metropolis, that is Delhi, Mumbai, and Kolkata. But about 50% is found in towns where population is less than 5 lakh. The larger cities do account for bulk of political, cultural, and academic interest in urban India. But small towns shall also be considered important in city studies. Those of us from smaller cities and towns will no doubt relate to this domination, which is rephrased via popular media as an impulse to escape to the bright lights of the big city. And yet, we also unthinkingly undermine the agglomerative desire every day through our discussions of the overburdened infrastructures, excessive pollution, and daily insecurities that people face in the metros. Regardless, it remains a truism that far less is written about small towns despite their ubiquity than the handful of metros. Sociologist Rowena Robinson, 2013, believes this is to be on account of the neat urban/rural binary, which dominates popular thought, leading to the tendency to take big cities as representatives of urbanization at large. Take, for instance, geographer Mike Davis' highly influential work Planet of Slums, where he cites rapid urbanization in the global south to argue that conurbations like Lagos, Mumbai, and Sao Paulo have displaced London, New York, and Paris as nodes of the urban world. But given widespread poverty, this process has made these cities progressively unlivable. No doubt these are massively important cities and urban poverty is a reality. But it is striking that Davis almost entirely misses the fact that the rate of urbanization in countries like India is actually higher in smaller towns, where moreover far less additional growth leads to greater marginal impacts. Critiquing this trend, two related arguments have been made more recently. First, that the fascination with the megacity needs to be problematized and research must attend to smaller cities and towns. And second, that the urban process, rather than cities per se, should be analytically privileged by urban scholars. Rather than the nested view of urbanization implicit in hierarchical categorization of cities, including the Indian census that classifies them from class 1 to class 6, the alternate approach is more interested in networked urbanity. The process and connection-oriented view of the urban owes much to the work of French theorist Henri Lefebvre, who in the late 1960s had already hypothesized what he called planetary urbanization, or the reshaping of the world at large due to the expansion of the urban processes. As a result, a variety of contexts have been transformed via cycles of migration, movement of commodities, and extraction of natural resources that together nourish the urban processes globally. An overarching emphasis on the metros in this scenario seems hardly appropriate. Let's take two examples of this shift in perspective. There are many small towns in the peri-urban fringes of large cities, which despite administrative independence behave like satellites. It then serves little value to engage in judicial thinking that gives the impression of autonomy when the matter at hand is one of dependence. Further, even a small town like Banjar in Kulu district of Himachal Pradesh contributes semi-skilled workers, fruits and vegetables to larger cities in Chandigarh, while receiving materials like cement, iron and consumer products in return. In census reports, Chandigarh and Banjar would be placed as part of different tables, class 1 and 6 respectively, and separated by end-to-winning classifications, but in reality they are simply differentiated nodes in the network process of regional urbanization. There is one last question that remains, that is, where exactly do we draw the lines of smallness? Or, when is a settlement small? This question would be easily answered in conventional studies using by, let's say, class 4 to 6 towns as per the census. But to us, it is a tricky matter since we emphasize connections and have pointed out the problems with technical sounding hierarchies. We must therefore work with a qualitative framework, which means settlements that residents and observers view through the prism of the small and habitually contrast with the country's metros make our list. Sociologist Louis' work also helps in thinking about a qualitative framework. In his paradigmatic essay, Urbanism as a Way of Life, Worth identified certain core features of urban life. These were thinness of relationships, high density of individuals and activities, and an extremely heterogeneous population. While it is true that even back the beyond towns are today more socially diverse than before owing to circuits of migration, one can use Worth's idea in a subjective manner to establish a gradient of urbanity and define smallness accordingly. With this background and framework in place, we now move on to cultural dynamics in small towns. It should be noted that we depart from the superorganic idea of culture that sees it as an autonomous casual entity, which is what people mean when they ascribe to culture independent paths. We view it instead as habituated way of life or common sense. that emerges from the historical interactions between people, their work, and their environment. That is culture as a product. Based on a review of recently produced literature, the following aspects are seen to co-produce everyday experiences and subjectivities, or culture in India's numerous small towns. First, economy and the world of work. What sustains a town? Second, infrastructural cultures. How do towns function? Third, representations and cultural production. How are towns talked about from outside and within? Fourth, identities and forms of subjugation. Who do people associate with and how? Economy and the world of work in small towns. For classical settlement geography literature, a town emerges as an administrative capital or garrison, as central market allowing for the trading of regional agricultural produce, or at the intersection of key transportation routes. Modernizing this framework, one can still see the state apparatus, economic specialization, and transportation networks play a critical role in sustaining the growth of contemporary small towns. What makes them different from larger cities is perhaps the fact that many towns are much more dependent on a single industry or resource. Take the case of Moradabad in Uttar Pradesh. That was, and in some measure still remains, a town renowned for brass-based handicrafts. Dindigul in Tamil Nadu, on the other hand, produces lock and steel safes for the country. Harda in southern Madhya Pradesh is a classical mandi or market town, especially for the buying and selling of wheat. Anand in Gujarat contains entire paraphernalia of activities connected to dairy production, while Munger in Bihar contributes to the larger world to things the licit-illicit divide, guns and tobacco. And finally, Kolhapur in Maharashtra is sustained in good measure its distinctive style of footwear produced there. In sum, while the paths these towns have traveled are varied, what is common is that they have carved a niche in the larger spatial division of labor. Some other towns have less industrial and more cognizant economic base. Siliguri in West Bengal is strategically located at a bottleneck between mainland India and the northeast. Raebareli in Uttar Pradesh has seen disproportionate growth and activity simply because it is one of a handful of VIP parliamentary constituency for Indira Gandhi, Rajiv Gandhi and Sonia Gandhi in India. Meanwhile, much capital finds its way to Mallapuram in Kerala and fuels its healthy economy in the form of remittance from migrant workers in the Gulf countries. In the era of globalization, the increased flow of capital into these towns and the growth of the so-called middle class has led to their recasting as a space of conspicuous consumption. Shopping malls, multiplex theaters, and new restaurant chains have reached towns across the country. LED televisions, mobile phones, and laptops are available on street corners across the breadth of the country and have led to a veritable revolution in communication. A report prepared by a private consultant for the CII showed that non-metros had larger rate of growth of demand for most non-essentials like cheese, chocolates, and packaged rice. If we talk about Marx's ideas about the close relationship between material life, especially production and cultural forms seriously, then it should follow that each of these towns' specialized economy has influenced the way in which people relate with each other and with the wider world. It should also follow from Marx's other precepts that communities are internally divided and that there is some amount of contestation and politics in support of various groups' attempts towards local hegemony. In this matter, economic history, formal politics, and struggles over ideological domination interact to shape the distinctive way of life of a given town. Ethnographic approaches are best suited to illuminate these complexities, and thankfully, some very few remarkable ones have been written about small towns. Sharachari's work on the knitwear producing town of Tirupur in Tamil Nadu shows the process through which working class men from the Gounder caste with a rural background came to wield power and dominate the industry and the town's politics. Chari calls theirs a form of fraternal capital, or networks glued by an articulation of shared history and put to use to exert centralizing power in an otherwise highly depressed industry. The vital importance of caste, otherwise seen as a uniquely cultural construct in the sphere of the economy of small towns, has also been shown in great detail in the work of Barbara Harris White, especially as a part of her longitudinal study of the town of Ani, also in Tamil Nadu. Here, changing economic base from agriculture and allied activities to skilled manufacturing has been the entrenchment of a class of capitalists who have perpetuated their domination through their caste networks in form of political economy that has been termed corporatists. In the somewhat different context of a company town of Bhilai, Jonathan Perry finds a link between employees' position in the rigid administrative hierarchy and their worldview. In this way, a town which, on the surface, purports a Nehruvian socialism-inspired egalitarianism, in reality has given birth to differentiated cosmopolitanisms, widely varied access to the world of opportunities and images, and consequent self-identifications. While several small towns display tremendous flexibility in adapting to the shifting dynamics of the larger economy, their dependence on one or the other economic activity also places them in a vulnerable situation given the vagaries of a capitalist economy. Take the case of the string of towns in the Midwestern United States that were linked to automobile manufacturing, centered in Detroit, and were therefore highly specialized in the production of specific component, for example rubber in Akron and glass in Toledo. But as the auto sector moved away from the region to places like Mexico, East and South Asia through the 1990s, these towns witnessed an economic nosedive. The region is in fact today known as the Rust Belt. Infrastructural cultures. According to Oxford English Dictionary, infrastructure includes the basic physical and organizational structures and facilities needed for the operation of a society. Small towns are generally laggard in these provisioning. They are needs-driven, informal, and often clandestine means of access are common. A culture of jugaad exemplifies small towns' relationship to infrastructure. Representations and cultural production. छोटे छोटे शहरों से हम तो झोला उठाकर चले. From small towns and boring afternoons, we pack our bags and leaves. So goes a small song from the popular Bollywood film Bunty and Bubbly, whose protagonists do exactly as they promise and build a career using the small town street smarts ways to swindle everyone from foreign tourists to the government. While these individuals look to escape the town to experience the new in Rabne Banadi Jori, residents are seen to engage elements of modernity in situ via consumption and new lifestyles, speaking to the changing cultural landscape. Shanghai, in turn, questions what it considers an uncritical celebration in small towns of all things modern. Contrastingly, in Gangs of Wasipur, quickly characters inhabit the Wasipur town in Jharkhand, engaged in decades of warfare centered on coal, land, and more than anything else, pride. In Ishkia, two on-the-run petty criminals find themselves in Gorakhpur world of intrigue, where outwardly simple woman coaxes them into fighting her battles. While Manorama 6 Feet Under sees a junior engineer in a fictional small town in Rajasthan, whose moonlights as a writer of pulp thrillers, embarking on an investigative project where he encounters several unlikely foes in the underbelly of a seemingly pouring down. Overall, Bollywood representations of small towns are symptomatic of the paradox that we had identified at the very beginning of the module. Popular imaginary, these spaces are either unexciting backwaters or hub of unsophisticated criminalities. As is discernible from the contemporaries of all the above listed films, this turn to small town culture as fodder is rather new. Previous to that, while Mofussil India made up a sizable share of audience for Bollywood fare, it was rarely made its subject. More importantly, small towns are not just material but also themselves significant sources of cultural production today. Some of the most popular artists, actors, and musicians trace their origins to non-metros. World-renowned sculptor Subodh Gupta, for instance, spent much of his life in and around Patna. According to artist Charu Choyal, artists in small towns lived a secluded life, which is better for creativity. They are not influenced by critics, while virtual exhibits and transactions make up for the thinness of local market. Despite Bollywood's dynastic ways, several famous actors and filmmakers from small towns have managed to make it big in Mumbai. Kangana Ranaut, one of the most famed actors right now, is from Mandi in Himachal Pradesh and learned the ropes in Chandigarh, while Sushant Singh Rajput and Nawazuddin Siddiqui are from Patna and Muzaffarpur respectively. These success stories have fueled many more dreams, and acting schools have opened in faraway towns to channel the interest. In turn, the simplification and decentralization of filmmaking and sound recording technologies have further enabled individuals in faraway places to participate in the creative industries. At the very least, these changes have enabled the launch of music and video industries, however nascent in small towns. Take the case of the Punjabi music industry, which is highly dispersed and numerous albums are produced in the state's small towns. But their market is now worldwide, thanks to the sizable Punjabi diaspora. Many artists have even crossed over into popular mediums like Indian pop and Bollywood. The Bhojpuri film and music industry based in Bihar is similarly popular while also being at once rooted and global, consumed as it is by migrants throughout India and diasporic community in places like Fiji and the Caribbean. Let's talk about some small town personalities. As in the arts and entertainment, small towns have challenged the erstwhile hegemony of metros and sports. MS Dhoni, the most successful Indian cricket captain ever, traces his journey as a cricketer to the town of Ranchi. Other cricket stars like Harbhajan Singh from Jalandhar and Ravindra Jadeja from Rajkot have also blazed the trail for youngsters from off the grid. So the towns of Bhiwani and Shahabad in Haryana have produced several world-class boxing and hockey stars respectively. Imphal in Manipur stands out as a nursery for various sports as well, and Thoiba Singh, Kothajit Singh in hockey and Mary Kom, and Devendra Singh in boxing have emerged from there. So India's most famous modern footballer, Baichung Bhutia, is from even a smaller town of Tingtim in Sikkim. Former Indian cricket captain Kapil Dev has talked about the resentment he encountered from his compatriots from established centers like Mumbai in his early days, but it is unlikely that such feelings persist, and given the widespread representations of small town men and women and talents from small towns all over India. So in some, while corporate honkos and business analysts have turned to the small town as a rising consumer for various commodities, including cultural ones, the process identified as and discussed in this module, it seems to suggest much more is afoot. They allude to the broadening of the nucleus of cultural production, and if not, its displacement towards what we refer to its peripheries. As in the arts and entertainment, small towns have challenged the erstwhile hegemony of the metros and sports. MS Dhoni, the most successful Indian cricket captain ever, traces his journey as a cricketer to the town of Ranchi. Other cricketer stars like Harbhajan Singh from Jalandhar and Ravinder Jadeja from Rajkot have also blazed the trail for youngsters from the off-the-grid. The towns of Bhiwani and Shahabad in Haryana have produced several world-class boxing and hockey stars respectively. Imphal in Manipur stands out as a nursery for various sports as well. Thoiba Singh and Kothaijit Singh from hockey and Mary Kom and Devendra Singh in boxing have emerged from there. India's most famous modern footballer Baichung Bhutia is from the even smaller town of Tingkitam in Sikkim. Former Indian cricket captain Kapil Dev has talked about the resentment he encountered from his compatriots from established centres like Mumbai in his early days. But it is unlikely that such feelings persist, given the widespread representations of small-town men and women now. In sum, while corporate honkos and business analysts have turned to the small towns as a rising consumer for various commodities, including cultural ones, the processes identified and discussed in this section seem to suggest much more is afoot. They allude to the broadening of the nucleus of cultural production, if not its displacement towards what were hitherto its peripheries. Identities and forms of subjugation. Despite material and livelihood shifts, Indian villages continue to be defined by the resilience of historical patterns of discrimination, particularly along lines of caste and gender. The former is built into space through practices of segregation and disparities in ownership of land and access to common resources, while patriarchy remains entrenched at the scale of social reproduction, that is, the family unit. On caste, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's following was expressed during the Constituent Assembly debates in 48 ring true. What is a village but a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness, and communalism, quote unquote. It was therefore no surprise that Ambedkar saw in cities the promise of freedom from these chains of subjugation. This conclusion resonates with Louis Wirth's views on urbanism around increased heterogeneity, backed further by German theorist Georg Simmel, who noted the domination of anonymity over social bonds in the city. Simmel was ambivalent about the implications of this development, since to him, individuals unmoored from deeper emotional attachment turned blasé and calculative in the city. Ambedkar, with his understanding of Indian village, however, seems to accept the German's empirical assertions but reject his moral conclusions. It was for precisely the reasons Simmel disturbed in urban life that Ambedkar considered it potentially emancipatory. All three of these thinkers, though were working with an ideal type of a city, implicitly with an imaginary of a metropolis. But what about the small town? How are older forms of subjugation negotiated in spaces that straddle anonymity and familiarity? And what new identities emerge at these interstices? Some commentators like Chandrabhan Prasad sees in towns more liberal attitudes and possibilities of civic engagement that transcend caste. Others, however, note caste resilience and are therefore less sanguine about these possibilities. Manu Joseph talks about the paradox that he describes as city setting but village mentalities. This is a complex issue, and one should stay clear of superficial verdicts. More engaged and possibly longitudinal studies are best suited to throw light on these changes. Certainly, urban areas, even smaller ones, afford more chances of upward mobility, given a greater array of economic opportunities. Moreover, the village-level hegemony of certain families is harder to reproduce at the scale of the town. Though, as Harris White and Chari's work cited above shows, caste alliances remain important. Even in a metropolis like Delhi, the work of caste is immense. In her study of the city's waste network, Kaveri Gill points to the caste-based division of labor, where a particular scheduled caste community, the Khatiks, has managed to create a near monopoly over the more valued parts of the chain, kabaris. While individuals from other diverse and marginalized groups are locked into the low-paying circuits of waste. Similarly, a study on the town of Chanderi, Madhya Pradesh, showed high degree of spatial segregation on caste lines despite a general improvement in the quality of life. Still, there are far more institutional and market spaces that allow for the mixing of populations and, even if temporary and conditional, suspension of caste identification in small towns. Relative to rural context, students in colleges and university get to experience radically different ways of relating to people with whom they would otherwise not have interacted as an equal. In the ubiquitous dhabas and junctions around food breakdown, while policies of affirmative action allow lower caste individuals to gain entry into the bureaucracy and formal politics. Relations between religious communities and their own internal identities are yet another highly contentious matter. A recent turning point in this process were the events leading and subsequent to the demolition of Babri Masjid in 1992. The town of Ayodhya, the purport birthplace of Lord Rama, was the epicenter of this politics and has forever etched its place in Indian history as an instance of communal polarization. During that period, several other small towns like Badayu, Aurangabad, Hazaribagh, and Hubli were also caught in the grip of violence. Since then, the speciality of Muslim urban populations changed dramatically. Large number of Muslims now clustered in specific neighborhood, which leads to heightened social segregation. A recent volume by Gere and Jefferlet shows the causes and outcomes of this shift in cities like Bhopal, Cuttack, and Calicut. While it may lead an immediate sense of security to an embattled minority, segregation produces new forms of insecurity bred by loss of interaction, stereotyping, and distrust in the long term. For instance, after the riots in Western Uttar Pradesh in 2013, Muslims who ran from the violence in mixed villages sought refuge in the few Muslim majority towns in the region, such as Kerala. Today, the overall regional geography is stark. Most villages are almost exclusively Hindu, while Kerala is a de facto Muslim ghetto. As for the hold of patriarchy over gender relations, the situation is once again more far from ideal. There is, of course, unevenness to all of this in general. Northern states display a far greater violent reaction to women's mobility than the South and Northeast. Take, for example, the town of Rohtak in Haryana, where women face multiple barriers at home and outside as they step into the world of higher education and professional work. The town received nationwide attention in 2014. 16-year-old girl committed suicide after prolonged stalking by a local man. Contradictions, participation in modern world, but also high degree of forced restrictions sit uneasily in such towns and are revealed in poignant words of her father. I understand the value of education. Nikita scored 97% marks in her last examination. The only restriction was that they could not go out with friends for a movie or anything. That we do not allow in villages like us. Quoted in Bharadwaj 2014. Quote unquote. Despite these challenges, many women are everyday changing the prevailing norms in towns across the country. The flip side to restrictive life for women in towns like Rohtak is a hyper-masculine culture that is internalized by men. This culture is highly performative. Young men must look, dress, and behave in a specific, well-defined way, or they risk being considered effeminate and therefore worthy of derision. They must in particular be seen to be in control of their relations with women, which translates to a certain kind of patronizing tolerance at best and violent suppression at worst. It is also tied with an entire economy that includes gyms and food supplements, steroids and drugs, and particular kinds of motorcycles and cars. It should be added that while this is certainly the dominant frame, it is not the only one and more useful way to understand male lives in small towns might be through a pluralizing move that is considering prevalent masculinities. The evidence points to the fact that previously existing modes of domination have rooted, but at the same time, experimentations related to gender roles and sexualities, often superstitions, are underway. Much has been made of the live-in relationship portrayed in the film Shuddha Deshi Romance in 2030 set in Jaipur. But that is merely one example of the changing times. Novel forms of identifications and interpersonal relationships are generally on the rise in small towns. Summarize what we have learned in this module till now. This module on small town culture, it argues that the subject should be considered through a dynamic lens. It begins with the hypothesis that there is no universal culture that unites small towns. What we have observed that cultures of work, of different forms of engagement with infrastructure that scaffold everyday life and how people think of themselves and relate with each other, and of arts, entertainment, and recreation. So, as readers and watchers would have noticed, this module does not consider a static condition that small towns are supposed to embody. There are instead a variety of underlying processes more extensive than a settlement per se, and extend to regional, national, and sometimes even planetary scales. Through migration and remittances, production of commodities for the market, consumption of things brought in from elsewhere, and cultural give and take, places have become intricately connected to each other. What lends singularity to a given locality is the conjectural throwing together of various forces and agents. And more recently in India, this has generally involved the way first state policy and lately amplified processes of globalization have found their way to specific urban areas. So their intersections produce a highly uneven landscape of development. Some towns are becoming more strong, they are booming, and while others are locked into stagnation. Certainly in the former, but even in others, much change is underway under the surface. Increased lower caste mobility and loosening of strict patriarchal norms are being seen. But so are attempts towards continued subjugation by the dominant classes. Religious polarization written into the streets and neighborhoods of small towns, it has widened in the last 3 decades. And still, these small towns are sites of all manner of creative experimentations, the results of which can be seen in their larger contribution to the nation's cultural economy. So these are interesting times in small town India, and students of urbanism have a ringside view.